At its peak, the British Empire ruled a quarter of the planet. 1 in 4 human beings on Earth answered to a king or queen sitting in a palace in London. The maps of the world were drenched in pink, the color British schoolchildren were taught to identify as theirs. India, Canada, Australia, huge chunks of Africa, islands scattered across every ocean, ports in China, mandates in the Middle East. The British had a saying about it. The sun never sets on the British Empire. And for almost 200 years, that was literally true. Somewhere in the world, a British flag was always catching the morning light. And then, in the space of about 20 years, almost all of it disappeared. Not slowly, not gracefully, almost overnight by the standards of empires. The Spanish Empire took 3 centuries to die. The Roman Empire took 4. The British Empire, the largest in human history, went from ruling a quarter of the world to being a medium-sized country off the coast of Europe in roughly the time it takes a child to grow up and finish school. By the 1970s, the empire was essentially gone. A few rocks in the Atlantic, a port in Asia on a 99-year lease, some tax havens in the Caribbean. That was it. So what happened? How does the most powerful empire in human history just vanish? Why couldn't anyone stop it? And here is the strangest part of all. The British themselves, in many cases, were the ones holding the door open as their colonies walked out. To understand the collapse, we have to start with how big the thing actually was, because the scale of the British Empire is hard to grasp even now. In 1920, after the First World War, the empire reached its absolute largest. It covered around 13 million square miles. It contained roughly 412 million people. It included India, the so-called jewel in the crown, with its 300 million subjects. It included entire continents worth of territory in Africa. It included Australia and New Zealand on the other side of the planet. It included Canada, almost as big as the United States. It included Egypt, Iraq, Palestine, Burma, Malaya, Ceylon, Hong Kong, Singapore, Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa, Jamaica, the Bahamas, and hundreds of smaller islands and outposts nobody could name without a map. The empire was held together by a strange mix of trickery, brute force, trade, and bluff. The British were never really numerous enough to actually occupy the places they ruled. There were only about 45 million people in Britain itself, governing nearly 10 times that number overseas. In India, a country the size of a continent, the British presence at any given time was rarely more than a few 100,000 soldiers, officials, and civilians. They ruled hundreds of millions of Indians with a handful of administrators and the constant threat that if anyone pushed back hard enough, the Royal Navy would arrive and start shooting. The Royal Navy was the real glue of the empire. For most of the 19th century, the British fleet was larger than the next 2 or 3 navies combined. It controlled every important sea lane on Earth. Gibraltar guarded the entrance to the Mediterranean. Suez controlled the route to India. Singapore locked down the passage between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific, the Cape of Good Hope, Aden, Malta, Hong Kong. The British did not need to occupy every country. They just needed to control the choke points, and they did. The empire also ran on money in a way no empire had before. London was the financial capital of the planet. The pound sterling was the world's reserve currency. British banks financed railways in Argentina, cotton mills in Egypt, mines in South Africa, plantations in Malaya. Even countries that were not formally part of the empire, like much of Latin America and large parts of China, were so deeply tied to British trade and credit that historians sometimes call them the informal empire. Of course, there was a brutal logic underneath all of this. The empire was extractive. India was systematically drained of wealth for 2 centuries, its industries crushed so that Britain could sell finished goods back to it. Africans were shipped across oceans as slaves for hundreds of years, and even after slavery ended, colonial labor was extracted under conditions barely different. Famines killed millions in India and Ireland, while grain shipments continued to leave for England. The empire was not a charity project, no matter what Victorian schoolbooks claimed. It was a machine for moving wealth from the colonies to the center, and for a long time, that machine ran beautifully. Then came 1914, and the machine started to break. The First World War was supposed to be the moment the British Empire showed the world its strength. Soldiers came from every corner of the map to fight for the king. Indians, Australians, Canadians, New Zealanders, South Africans, West Indians, Africans from a dozen colonies. They fought in the trenches of France, in the deserts of the Middle East, in East Africa, at Gallipoli. By the time it ended in 1918, Britain had won, technically, and even gained more territory. Germany's African colonies were handed over. The Ottoman Empire's Arab provinces were carved up between Britain and France. The empire was bigger than it had ever been. But underneath the victory, something fundamental had cracked. The war had cost Britain almost 1 million dead. It had cost something even more important: money. Britain had entered the war as the world's largest creditor. Every country owed London money. Britain came out of the war as a debtor, owing enormous sums to a new financial power across the Atlantic, the United States. The pound was still strong. The City of London still ran the world's finance, but the long, slow shift had begun. The center of gravity was moving west, and the colonies had noticed something during the war. They had bled for an empire that, when the fighting stopped, did not seem terribly grateful. Indian soldiers had fought and died in the hundreds of thousands. When they came home to the same colonial rule, the same racial hierarchy, the same exclusion from real power. In 1919, just months after the war ended, a British general named Reginald Dyer ordered his troops to open fire on an unarmed crowd in a walled garden in Amritsar. Hundreds of Indians died. The massacre became a turning point. Indians who had been willing to work within the system started asking why they should bother. A lawyer named Mohandas Gandhi, who had spent the war years organizing in South Africa and India, began turning that anger into something organized: non-violent resistance, boycotts, marches, civil disobedience. The British did not know how to fight it. You could shoot rebels. You could not shoot a man sitting peacefully on the ground refusing to move. The first cracks were appearing in the wall, and the British, busy congratulating themselves on winning the war, did not quite see them yet. The 1920s and 1930s were a strange time for the empire. On the surface, everything still looked grand. The maps were still pink. The Royal Navy still patrolled the oceans. The king still received tribute from princes and sultans in jeweled ceremonies. London was still the largest city in the world. The empire even acquired a new name during this period, the British Commonwealth, which sounded more like a club than an occupation. But the foundations were quietly being eaten away. In Ireland, the closest colony of all, a brutal war for independence ended in 1921, with most of the island walking away from British rule. The Irish Free State was born. For the first time in centuries, a major piece of the empire had successfully broken off. It happened on Britain's own doorstep, and the British government, exhausted from the World War, had decided it was not worth fighting another grinding guerrilla campaign to keep it. The lesson was not lost on observers elsewhere. Empires could be made to let go. In India, Gandhi's movement kept growing. The Salt March of 1930, when Gandhi walked 240 miles to the sea to make salt in defiance of a British tax, captured the imagination of the world. Photographs of a small, thin man in a homespun shawl outwitting the most powerful empire on earth ran in newspapers from New York to Tokyo. The British arrested him repeatedly. Each arrest made him more famous. Each time he was released, the movement was larger. In the Middle East, the territories Britain had grabbed from the Ottomans were proving impossible to govern. Iraq was in revolt within months of being handed over. Palestine was a slow-motion disaster, with the British trying to balance promises they had made to both Arabs and Jews during the war, promises that could not possibly both be kept. Egypt had been granted nominal independence in 1922, but was still effectively run from London, and the Egyptians were furious about it. The money problem kept getting worse. The Great Depression hit in 1929, and Britain, like everyone else, fell into economic chaos. Pound went off the gold standard in 1931. The empire was suddenly cutting budgets everywhere. Colonial garrisons were reduced. Infrastructure projects were cancelled. The machine was running on momentum and habit. Then, in 1939, the Germans invaded Poland, and the whole thing was put to the ultimate test. The Second World War was the moment the British Empire broke its own back to win. The British liked to remember the war as their finest hour, and in many ways it was. They stood alone against Nazi Germany for a critical year. They endured the Blitz. They produced Churchill's speeches and the courage of pilots in the Battle of Britain. All of that is true. But the war that saved Britain also killed the Empire, and Churchill, who loved the Empire more than almost anyone alive, was the man who had to sign the bills. The financial cost was catastrophic. Britain spent every shilling it had, then borrowed every shilling it could, then borrowed more. By 1945, Britain owed staggering sums to the United States, to Canada, to India of all places, and to a long list of colonies that had been forced to lend money to London during the fighting. The country that had once been the world's banker was now the world's biggest debtor. The pound was wobbling. Food was still rationed years after the war ended. Bread, which had not been rationed during the war itself, was rationed in 1946 because the country could not afford the wheat. Military cost was even harder to absorb. The British Army, Navy, and Air Force had been stretched across the planet. But in Asia, something had happened that could not be undone. In 1942, the Japanese had captured Singapore, the supposedly impregnable fortress that guarded the route to Australia and India. 80,000 British and Imperial troops surrendered in a single afternoon. It was the largest surrender in British military history. Hong Kong fell. Burma fell. Malaya fell. The Japanese, an Asian power, had humiliated the White Empire in front of every Asian person who lived under it. The myth of British invincibility, the bluff that had held the empire together for 2 centuries, was finished. Indians, Burmese, Malayans, and millions of others had watched the British run. They had watched white soldiers be marched into prison camps by Asian soldiers. The psychological glue dissolved. After the war, when the British came back and tried to act as if nothing had changed, the colonies looked at them and saw something different. They saw a tired, broke country pretending to still be a superpower. And the pretending was no longer working. The end was coming fast now. Faster than anyone in London was ready to admit. It started with India. It had to. India was the heart of the empire, the reason for half the navy, the foundation of British prestige. Without India, the rest of the empire did not really make sense. And by 1945, holding India was no longer possible. A new British government had come to power that summer, led by Clement Attlee, a quiet man who was the opposite of Churchill in almost every way. Attlee's Labour Party had won a landslide election promising welfare, housing, and the end of empire. The British people, exhausted by 6 years of war, did not want to spend the next decade fighting colonial wars to hold on to places they could no longer afford. They wanted the National Health Service. They wanted homes. They wanted bread without ration cards. In India, the situation was beyond saving. Gandhi's movement had become a tidal wave. The Indian National Congress and the Muslim League had millions of members. Indian soldiers who had fought for Britain during the war were coming home with weapons training and no patience left. The Royal Indian Navy mutinied in Bombay in 1946. British officials in Delhi sent panicked cables to London saying the situation could explode at any moment. Attlee made the decision. India would be granted independence. The only question was how to leave. He sent a man named Louis Mountbatten, a member of the royal family with a charming smile and an enormous ego, to handle the transition. Mountbatten arrived in Delhi in March 1947. He had been given until June 1948 to organize the British withdrawal. He decided he could do it faster. He set the deadline for August 1947, less than 5 months away, for one of the largest, most complicated countries on Earth. The result was a disaster. India was to be split into 2 countries, India and Pakistan, along religious lines. Hindus and Sikhs on one side, Muslims on the other. The actual border was drawn by a British lawyer named Cyril Ratcliffe, who had never been to India before and was given 5 weeks to do it. He drew lines through villages, through farms, through families. When the border was announced, around 15 million people found themselves on the wrong side of it and began the largest mass migration in human history. Somewhere between 1 and 2 million of them did not survive the journey. The horror of partition is hard to describe and was largely ignored in Britain at the time. Trains arrived at stations packed with corpses, every passenger murdered along the way. Refugee columns stretched for miles, attacked by mobs from the other religion. Women were abducted, mutilated, killed. Whole villages were burned. The British, who had ruled India for almost 2 centuries on the grounds that Indians could not govern themselves without British supervision, walked out the door in August 1947 and left the bleeding behind them. Mountbatten was praised in London for his efficiency, but India was independent. And once India was gone, the rest of the empire started falling almost in sequence, like a row of carefully placed dominoes finally tipping. Burma went in 1948. Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, went the same year. Palestine, where the British had spent 30 years failing to keep a lid on the conflict between Arabs and Jews, was simply abandoned in May 1948. The British troops sailed away. The new state of Israel was declared the next day. War broke out within hours. Britain washed its hands of the whole thing. The Middle East was unraveling everywhere. In 1952, a group of Egyptian army officers led by a young colonel named Gamal Abdel Nasser overthrew the British-friendly King of Egypt. 4 years later, Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, the waterway that for nearly a century had been the artery of the British Empire, the lifeline to India and Asia. Britain, France, and Israel decided to take it back. The Suez Crisis of 1956 was supposed to be a demonstration that the old powers could still throw their weight around. Instead, it became the most public humiliation in modern British history. British and French paratroopers landed along the canal. The military operation was actually succeeding. And then the phone rang in Downing Street. It was the President of the United States, Dwight Eisenhower, and he was furious. The Americans had not been consulted. They threatened to crash the pound by selling off their sterling reserves. They demanded the British withdraw immediately. Britain folded. The troops were pulled out. The whole adventure collapsed within days. The lesson, broadcast to the world, was unmistakable. The British Empire could not even take back its own canal without American permission. The superpower was gone, and everyone now knew it. After Suez, the dismantling moved with almost embarrassing speed. The British government, now under a man named Harold Macmillan, looked at the books, looked at the map, and made a quiet decision. The empire was finished. The only question left was how quickly it could be wound down without total chaos. In 1960, Macmillan flew to South Africa and gave a speech that became famous as the Wind of Change address. He told the white South African parliament, sitting in stunned silence, that the wind of change was blowing through their continent, and that whether they liked it or not, African nationalism was a fact. The British were getting out. The South Africans, who would cling to apartheid for another 30 years, were furious. The Africans listening on the radio were electrified. What followed was the fastest dismantling of an empire in human history. In 1957, Ghana had already become the first African colony to gain independence. After Macmillan's speech, the floodgates opened. Nigeria in 1960, Sierra Leone and Tanganyika in 1961, Uganda in 1962, Kenya in 1963, Northern Rhodesia, which became Zambia in 1964, Nyasaland, which became Malawi in 1964, Gambia in 1965, Bechuanaland, which became Botswana in 1966, Basutoland, which became Lesotho in 1966, Swaziland in 1968. By the end of the 1960s, almost the entire map of British Africa was independent. Countries that had been ruled from London for a century were suddenly running their own affairs, often with constitutions hastily drafted on the way out the door, often with borders drawn by Europeans who had never visited the places they were dividing. Some of these new countries would do well. Many would not. The British were no longer responsible. The British were going home. The Caribbean went the same way. Jamaica, Trinidad, Barbados, the Bahamas all became independent in the 1960s and 1970s. Cyprus in 1960, Malta in 1964, Mauritius in 1968, Fiji in 1970, Tonga the same year. The list reads like a roll call at the United Nations, which is exactly what it was. The UN had begun with 51 member states in 1945. By 1980, it had over 150. Most of the difference came from the dismantling of the European empires, and most of that came from Britain. The empire was vanishing so fast that British schoolchildren could not keep up with which maps were still accurate. For the British themselves, the strangest part of all this was how little it seemed to register. There were no riots in London demanding the empire be saved. There were no political parties campaigning to hold on to Kenya or Malaysia. The British public, who had been told for generations that the empire was the greatest civilizing force in human history, watched it disappear with something close to indifference. They had other things on their mind: the new welfare state, council housing, television, the Beatles, mini-skirts. The country was reinventing itself as a modern European nation, and the empire was beginning to feel like an embarrassing relative nobody wanted to talk about. There were some loose ends. Rhodesia, the white minority colony in southern Africa, illegally declared independence in 1965 to avoid handing over power to its black majority. Britain refused to recognize it and imposed sanctions, but tellingly did not invade. It would take 15 more years and a bloody civil war before the country, now Zimbabwe, finally had a legitimate government. Falkland Islands, a windswept rock in the South Atlantic almost nobody in Britain could find on a map, were invaded by Argentina in 1982. Margaret Thatcher sent a task force 8,000 miles to take them back. The British won. It was the last great imperial military operation, and it was fought over a place with fewer than 2,000 inhabitants. By the 1990s, what was left of the empire was a handful of small islands and one enormous loose end: Hong Kong. Hong Kong had been seized from China in 1841 after the Opium Wars, one of the more shameful chapters of British history. A 99-year lease on most of the territory had been signed in 1898. That lease was due to expire on July 1, 1997. By the 1980s, it was clear that Britain could not, and probably should not try to extend it. China was a rising power. The Royal Navy of 1997 was not the Royal Navy of 1897. Negotiations began. The handover ceremony on the night of June 30, 1997 was the symbolic end. Prince Charles stood in the rain. The Union Jack came down. The Chinese flag went up. Britain handed back a city of 6 million people, one of the great financial centers of Asia. And just like that, the empire that had once ruled a quarter of the world was, for all practical purposes, over. So how did it happen? How did the largest empire in human history vanish in roughly the span of a single human lifetime? The simple answer is money. The empire had always been a financial operation as much as a military one, and the 2 world wars had bankrupted the company. Britain came out of 1945 owing more money than it could ever realistically repay while running. Soldiers cost money. Bases cost money. Administrators cost money. When the bills came due and the colonies started demanding to leave, the British government did the math and realized the math did not work. You cannot run an empire on credit forever. Eventually, somebody asks for the bill. The deeper answer is that the bluff stopped working. The British Empire had always been held together by the perception of British power, the idea that resistance was futile because the Royal Navy would always arrive and the British Army would always win. The Second World War shattered that perception. Singapore falling to the Japanese, British prisoners marched through Asian streets, the desperate evacuation at Dunkirk, the Americans rescuing the pound at Suez. Every one of these moments told the colonies the same thing. The giant could be beaten. The giant could be made to leave. And the deepest answer is that the people the empire ruled simply stopped accepting it. Gandhi in India, Nkrumah in Ghana, Kenyatta in Kenya, Nasser in Egypt. Millions of people who had been told for generations that they were incapable of governing themselves decided they were going to do it anyway. The British could have tried to hold on by force. The French tried in Algeria and Vietnam, and it nearly destroyed France. The British, perhaps to their credit, perhaps just because they could not afford another option, chose to leave instead. What remains today is the Commonwealth, a voluntary club of former colonies that meets occasionally and plays cricket. A handful of overseas territories, mostly tax havens and rocks in the ocean. A king who is the head of state in 15 countries, including Canada and Australia, though even that is starting to feel less certain. And a language that ended up spoken by billions of people around the world. which is perhaps the most enduring inheritance of all. The sun did finally set on the British Empire, and when it did, almost nobody noticed it was gone.